So back in the year 2000, I released a music CD of original songs that I had written. And one of the songs in that CD was called "I Will Follow You." And I think I may have sung it here once. The first line of the song is, "You left your throne in glory for a manger filled with hay." I think all of us, one of the first things we learn when we become Christians is the fact that Jesus left his throne in glory and was born in that lowly manger. And then he dwelt among us. He lived like we did, experiencing all the things that we experience. And then he went to the cross as God's sacrificial lamb, the sacrificial lamb that takes away the sins of the world. I think we all understand that. That's kind of Christianity 101. That's the basics of the gospel. But what I don't know that we really understand is how much Jesus gave up. How much he gave up to leave heaven behind to come dwell on earth. And that's because we really don't know much about heaven, about what it's like, what goes on in heaven, all the majesty, all of the stuff in heaven that he turned his back on to come here to take our place on the cross. Well, today we are in week 8 of our series through the book of Revelation. And we're in chapter 4. And in this chapter, the Apostle John begins to give us a glimpse into heaven. And today in particular, it's in the throne room of heaven. So we're going to learn a little bit more about heaven and the throne of God and what Jesus left behind to come here, to be born in that manger filled with hay. So we are going to read Revelation chapter 4. We're going to read the whole chapter. It's kind of a short chapter. It's only 11 verses. So I don't have the words of the whole chapter up here. So if you want to follow along, turn to Revelation chapter 4. And I'm going to read the chapter, and then we'll go back and kind of dissect it a little bit, a few verses at a time. So Revelation chapter 4. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. And around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, and rumblings, and peals of thunder. And before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. All around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, "Worthy are you, O Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. The Apostle John has a tough job. He has to define or describe for us in human terms what heaven looks like. And there are things that no living human anyway, had seen. And he has to try to describe that. So he uses a lot of comparison words. He uses the word like a lot. So he tries to describe with things that we are somewhat familiar with what he is seeing in heaven. He's trying to describe the indescribableness of heaven. So he has a tough job. The Bible mentions heaven over 400 times. All throughout the Bible, heaven is mentioned over 400 times, yet we really know very little about what heaven is like. There's a few descriptive words here and there, but it's really hard for us to get our minds around what all Jesus gave up when he left heaven and what it's going to be like when he calls us home to be there with him. So let's take a look at John's description now and see what we might be able to learn about John's experience and his description of heaven. So first John says that there was a door standing open in heaven. And Jesus invited him to come up here. And then in verse 2, John says that instantly he was taken up to heaven and there was a throne. And he doesn't tell us how that happened. Did an angel come down and swoop him up and take him to heaven? Did a burning chariot come and pick him up? Or did he climb Led Zeppelin's stairway to heaven? We don't know. He just all of a sudden is in the Spirit and is in heaven. When Jesus called John up to heaven, he said, I will show you what must take place. And this is the second time that Jesus has said that. In chapter 1, he told John, I'm going to show you what must take place. And here again in chapter 4. So the things that John is describing for us is not just something that possibly might happen. No, it's something that could happen. No, this is going to happen. Everything that he's describing in this book is what must take place because it is the will of God, and God's will take place. So the first thing that John saw when he arrived in heaven was the throne of God. In verses 2 and 3 he writes, At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of emerald. John mentions the throne of God in the book of Revelation over 40 times. The throne is always the center of all the action. John's going to describe a lot of things going on here in heaven, but it's always around the throne of God. The throne of God is the center of what's going on in heaven. Then in verse 3, John tries to describe God for us. Because God is the one sitting on the throne, and he looks and then he tries to describe what he saw. He says that he had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. Here's a picture of carnelian up in the upper left and jasper, the 4 pictures in the lower right. The precious gemstones. And you'll notice they kind of range in colors from oranges, maybe some little yellowish oranges, up to bright reds and dark reds. And to me, that color of these stones reminds me of either the setting or the rising sun. You know how the sun at the two extremes takes on a reddish, orangish color, and it's still bright and glowing. But when it's noonday sun, it's bright white and blinding. But as it sets, it takes on a different color, and it's kind of the color of these gemstones. And then John says that beyond that, behind the throne, there was a rainbow with the appearance of emerald. And here's what emerald looks like. I think we're all familiar with emeralds. They are various shades of green, from light green to dark green. And this rainbow looked like an emerald. Well, I found it interesting, this time of year, when John looked at the throne of God, he saw reds and greens. And what does that remind you of? Well, our Christmas colors are reds and greens. I just thought that was interesting. So John's description of God seated on his throne, John's not the only one who mentions that. It's a common theme of God seated on his throne. There are many, many passages throughout the Bible that mentions God seated on his throne. Here's one example in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. Isaiah says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." So a takeaway for us here is that God is on his throne. We can take comfort in that. No matter how crazy things get in this world, no matter how upside down our world may become, no matter what's going on in our life and how bad our life situation may become, we can draw comfort in knowing that God is on the throne. God is still in control.
Amen.
So after describing God and his throne, John moves on to describe some of the other things that he sees in heaven. And some of them are pretty strange to us. And John is doing his best to try to explain in language so we can understand what he is seeing. First, in verse 4, he says that around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. So John says that in the middle of heaven is God's throne, but around those thrones are 24, around his throne are 24 other thrones. And seated upon them are 24 elders. And this is consistent throughout the book of Revelation. In chapter 5, 7, 11, 14, and 19, John mentions the same number of thrones and elders that are involved in heaven. So he sees 24 thrones and 24 elders seated on these thrones, and they're wearing white robes. Here again we see that imagery of white, purity and holiness in those who are around the throne of God. But who are these elders? Where do these elders come from? Who are they? Well, John doesn't tell us. Nowhere in Revelation does he really explain who these elders are. So because of that, there's some speculation as to who these elders are. Two main schools of thought, and one of them, I guess you can look at, that one is kind of two thoughts as well. He sees 24 elders, and one school of thought is that this represents the religious leaders of the Old Testament, the priests and the Levites from the Old Testament. In 1 Chronicles chapter 24, the priests are divided into 24 groups, and each of those groups is assigned a leader. So one school of thought is that those 24 elders are the leaders of the 24 groups of priests. Well, in 1 Chronicles chapter 25, the Levites are also separated into 24 groups, and they're each assigned a leader. So it could be that it's the 24 Levite leaders that are the 24 elders. Or a combination, 12 of each, something like that. So that's one general school of thought, is that it's the priests and or Levites from the Old Testament. But there's another school of thought that many Bible scholars believe that the 24 elders actually represent a unification of the Old and New covenants. That those who represent the Old Covenant and those who represent the New Covenant. Well, those who represent the Old Covenant would be the nation of Israel. In the nation of Israel, there are 12 tribes. So 12 of the 24 elders could be the 12 patriarchs from the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the new covenant with Jesus, the people involved in that were represented by the 12 apostles. And so the other 12 would be the apostles. And this is supported because later in the book of Revelation, chapter 7, the 12 tribes of Israel are listed, And then in chapter 21, when the New Jerusalem is brought down, the New Jerusalem has 12 gates on which the names of the 12 tribes of Israel are placed. And then the 12 foundations of the New Jerusalem are the 12 apostles. So it's a lot of support for that school of thought. And there are a couple other theories, but all of it is speculation because the Bible doesn't specifically tell us who these elders are. But if I had to choose one, I would say it's probably that latter model where it's the patriarchs of the nation of Israel and the 12 apostles. All right, verses 5 and 6. John continues, "From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal." When I first read this, you know what came to my mind? Knowing how obsessed, I guess we would say, our family is, cosmic bowling is what came to mind here. Have you ever been to cosmic bowling? They turn off all the lights, and then they have these flashing lights like lightning, and then as the balls roll down the lane, you hear the rumbling, and then the peals of thunder are like when the balls crash into the pins.
I never had that problem.
Your ball never hit the pins? Well, and to my defense, when I was a little boy, I was afraid of thunder. And my mom told me, "Don't be afraid, it's just God and the angels bowling." Moms don't lie, right? I'm just saying, to me, I pictured cosmic bowling. Now, some of you may not go there, but if you think of this experience, it's a worship service going on, and there's lightning and thunder, and it's like an awesome light show at a Christian concert, right? The ultimate worship service going on in heaven. There's lightning, there's thunder, and then there's these 7 torches that John says represents the 7 spirits of God. Well, we've touched on this before. That is either the 7 angels of the churches or it's the 7 churches. So we're not going to spend time on that. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to the last part of verse 6 into verse 8, which says, "And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature, like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.'" I cannot imagine what these creatures really look like. The way that John describes them is just, to us, it seems bizarre, these creatures. And there's a lot of speculation about what these creatures are and what they represent. So first, let's take a look at what these creatures are. You know, the Bible is a very unique book, and many times it interprets itself. You find something that you're kind of struggling with, you don't understand what it means, and there's another book in the Bible someplace that helps interpret it. Well, that's the case here. If you look at the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, the prophet Ezekiel describes a similar vision that he had, similar to John's. Ezekiel's description is kind of long, so I'm just going to pick a few of the verses out, but if you want to read Ezekiel chapter 1 as homework, you can go ahead and do that. But let's take a look at a few verses to help us answer what are these creatures. So in Ezekiel chapter 1, we'll look at verse 1, 5, and 10. Verse 1. "In the 30th year, in the 4th month, and the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar canal, the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God." Verse 5. "And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures." Now listen to the description in verse 10 of these four creatures. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The four had the face of a lion on the right side. The four had the face of an ox on the left side. And the four had the face of an eagle. So both John and Ezekiel's visions were very, very similar. They're not exact. In John's vision, each of the four animals had just one face. So one looked like a lion, one looked like an ox, one looked like a man, and one looked like an eagle. In Ezekiel's description, they each had all four faces, which is really, I think, would freak me out if I saw something like that. But their descriptions are very, very similar. So because of that, most scholars agree that what John and Ezekiel are seeing are the same creatures. So then if we move on to Ezekiel chapter 10, he again describes his vision of heaven. But this time he says that those four creatures are four cherubim. And he says that these cherubim had many wings and many eyes. And then let's look at how he describes their faces. In Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 14, he said, and every one had four faces. The first face was the face of the cherub. And the second face was a human face. And the third, the face of a lion. And the fourth, the face of an eagle. So again, a very similar description. The only difference here that instead of a face of an ox, it had the face of a cherub. But all the other descriptions are the same. So because of that, most scholars believe that the four creatures that John is describing are actually cherubim. So what is a cherubim? Cherubim is a certain type of angel. Angels are described all throughout the Bible, and there are three different types of angels mentioned in the Bible. There are cherubim, seraphim, and archangels. The fact that John saw cherubim around the throne of God is consistent with the other places that cherubim are mentioned. Most often cherubim are mentioned in relation to the throne of God. So what do the four faces mean? No one's really sure, but I guess that the common consensus is that they all had the face of a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a man. So they suggest that the lion represents the strength of a lion, the service of an ox, the speed of an eagle, and the intelligence of a man. So what John might be telling us here is that these cherubim are the noblest, strongest, swiftest, and wisest of all of God's servants. So why do they have 6 wings? Well, perhaps that these angels were built for speed. They're a servant of God and they need to go wherever God tells them to go, and so they have 6 wings so they can get there quickly. I don't know. That's a possibility. And what about all of the eyes? Why do they have eyes all around their head? What does that mean? Well, these angels must have incredible perception, insight, and awareness. Nothing escapes their notice. Again, they're kind of like moms. They have eyes in the back of their head. Nothing escapes mom's notice. So what were these angels doing? As John describes what's going on in heaven, and he says these 4 creatures are there, what's their purpose? What were they doing there? Well, they are leading an incredible worship service. They are leading everyone else around the throne is following their lead when it comes to worshiping God, the one who sits on the throne. Once the creatures begin their worship, the 24 elders join in. And notice what their worship is centered around. If you look at what the 4 creatures said and what the elders say, they are all centered around God's holiness, around God's glory, around God's power, and the fact that He is the creator of everything. So in John's vision, we see that the natural response to being in God's presence is one of worship. And our takeaway from this should be our worship should be modeled after the worship that's going on in heaven. So all of our worship should be centered on the holiness, the glory, the power, and the creativity, or the fact that God is the creator of all things. You know, when we gather together here on Sunday mornings and we have our time of worship, it's real hard for us sometimes to clear our minds and stop thinking about all our own problems. You know, we kind of focus on ourselves instead of truly focusing on worshiping God. We need to be like those 24 elders. What did they do? As soon as the creatures began worship, the elders fell down on their knees. They cast their crowns before the Lord, before the throne of God. And that's what we need to do. When we enter into God's presence, that casting of the crowns is like, you know, getting the focus off of ourselves. It's not about me. Worship is about God, about His holiness, about His power, about His glory, and the fact that He is our Creator. So whether it's Christmas time and we're focusing on the birth of our Lord, or it's other days throughout the year, even your private worship time, there is a time for us to come before God with our concerns and our worries about ourselves. But when it comes to worship, we need to cast our crowns before God and focus all of our worship on He who sits on the throne, on worshiping the glory of God, the holiness of God, and His power, and recognize that He is the creator of all things. So when we come together, let's cast our crowns before the throne of God and truly focus our worship on Him, He who sits on the throne, He who lives forever and ever. Amen.